Hello and welcome to the Directors' Dialogues from the Climate Governance Initiative, where we lift the lid on the different ways that company board members are speaking up for climate in their boardrooms. In each episode, we meet a climate champion who's been leading or nudging or badgering their boardroom colleagues towards climate-friendly policies and practices. I'm Alexandra Bolton.
And I'm Matthew Moss. And today we're delighted to have Lisa Bougie as our guest. Lisa is a member of one of the chapters in our network at the NACD in the United States. She serves on the chapter's Climate Advisory Council, which was set up last year. She's a very experienced board director, strategic advisor, and an investor with extensive experience in consumer goods and a special emphasis on fashion and retail. Lisa's worked with Stitch Fix, Nike, Patagonia, Gap in her executive roles, and she sits on the board of 4 private companies. As well, she's an investor and an advisor with Alante Capital.
Lisa was one of 4 board directors who joined us at the World Economic Forum in Geneva earlier this year for a workshop on how board directors can use their positions to influence their companies towards climate-positive policies and practices. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you so much. I am eager to get into this conversation.
It's a delight to have you with us, and we're really looking forward to the conversation, Lisa. First, let's hear a little bit about you. I'm keen to hear about your education, your early steps on the career ladder, how you first started thinking about climate. Talk to us a little about that.
Thank you so much for asking that question. I'm a big fan of context always. And I think it's important to say that from the very beginning of my career, I have been values-led. I can attribute that gravitational pull to my education at Santa Clara University, which happened to be a Jesuit education deeply rooted in getting in touch and ultimately following one's values. I was very lucky that my first paying job at the age of 14 in the US, yes, that is possible, was in retail at a company called Nordstrom, which you may have heard. And at that young age, I was able to see a world and a path for myself whereby I might be able to fuse my love of fashion with my interest in business. Ultimately, I did just that by going to Santa Clara University, attending the Retail Management Institute, majoring in marketing, and ultimately forging an operating career amongst the most disruptive retail leaders in the industry at their time. 6 years ago, I left my operating role at Stitch Fix, and I did so to create a portfolio of brands and businesses that I would work with in a number of ways, but one of which is through leadership. Since then, I've developed a portfolio of a number of brands and businesses, each of which have a values orientation that is aligned with my own, many of which are oriented toward climate action, also wellness and female leadership.
Thank you. That's fantastic. To hear that you've started in operational roles before moving to these advisory and leadership roles, what experiences have you found valuable when supporting climate action and climate governance in the boardroom?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting just to pause for a moment and talk a bit about the boards that I serve on. They are, in no particular order, Eileen Fisher, Aura, Pendleton Woolen Mills, and also Maker Sites. 2 out of the 3 are B corporations, one of which I would consider the OG of sustainability in the fashion world, and that is Eileen Fisher. It's not by happenstance that my first board role was actually at Eileen Fisher, and was a perfect opportunity at a perfect moment whereby I had decided to leave my operating role at Stitch Fix and to begin to build my portfolio. And when the Eileen Fisher opportunity presented itself, it was pretty much a check in terms of industry alignment, values alignment, and also what I saw as opportunity. And the reason that I want to pause there is that it's quite a unique situation in the sense that the Eileen Fisher company and Eileen herself has been created a values-oriented company from day one, which was over 40 years ago. However, what I found to be true when I joined the board and began working with the team, both kind of at an executive level and also from a governance standpoint, is that despite a tremendous amount of energy and, air quote, doing good within the company, they hadn't yet perfected the marriage of purpose with strategic intention. And the biggest value that I believe we have created as a board in the last 6 years is marrying the purpose and the intentions of the company relative to kind of starting right from the beginning with a very intentional, integrated strategic orientation that ultimately has yielded greater results literally for all stakeholders.
Lisa, thanks so much for that. I'm remembering when we were together in Geneva at the workshop, we heard something about the importance of being a first mover as opposed to even a fast follower. And you've just given us a brilliant example in Eileen Fisher of a company that wasn't afraid to be a first mover in the sector. And it's a tricky sector. The fashion industry obviously is well known to be very, very resource intensive in terms of the water that it uses, the chemicals it uses. And it's estimated to be responsible for as much as 8 to 10% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So if there's one sector where it's important to get this right, it's the fashion sector. To what extent do you think that the sector in general has taken on the responsibility of that position? To what extent are they comfortable with having this sort of conversation in the boardrooms and following the lead that has been set by companies like Eileen Fisher?
So certainly the facts that you state are accurate. It's estimated that 8 to 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions are coming from the fashion industry. It's also true that approximately 96 to 98% are scope 3. And the root cause is related to the following: fiber production or materials, you could call it, manufacturing or garment production, transportation / supply chain, and then lastly, use and disposal. So I think, certainly when solving problems, we have to understand the parts of the problem. So it's important to recognize those 4 parts, and we probably don't want to get deep into them. But the answer to your question kind of remains in those 4 parts, which is to say, it is my experience that the recognition of responsibility is there. It is my experience that increasingly so, enterprise companies, not just an Eileen Fisher, are taking responsibility. But it's equally my experience that while literally all of the solutions exist, they don't all exist yet at scale. And of course, we know the consequence of that. The consequence of that is it's more expensive because we haven't reached economies of scale yet. Perhaps accessibility is hard because the solutions aren't known by everyone. One of my favorite quotes that I reminded my son the other day is, "The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed." And this rings so true for the question that you've just asked. And so, we can get into obstacles, but the truth is, of course, one has to have a long-term mindset here. But what would be important to know is all stakeholders increasingly care, especially customers. That is helping the gravitational kind of movement. Certainly, it's true that while regulation has not historically existed, it now is coming to bear, which is helpful. And as a board director for the boards I serve on, but also as a venture partner and investor, I'm so pleased to be in this moment where we have the solutions, and now it's about unlocking their potential and getting them to scale to be able to solve the 8% problem that you've referred to.
It's great to hear that the solutions are here. And that's something that I'm hearing time and time again in different sectors, that, we have the tech, we have the solution. It's just, in inverted commas, we just have to implement them. And I love your quote about the future's here. It's just not equally distributed. I haven't heard that before. So true. Obviously, some firms are doing a fantastic job at implementing those solutions, at picking them up, at being the torchbearers, the first movers. How do those firms act as a beacon for the opportunities for fashion brands wanting to transition to a more sustainable business model?
So I think, just going back to the Eileen Fisher example, what's so fascinating about the reality of the way in which practices within the company and now outside the company have unfolded is absolutely from the inside out, right? So started with values and culture, as I spoke to, then kind of spread to intentional strategy, and then structure, and then process, and then rewards, and now coalition. And this is the exciting moment for me, not just Eileen Fisher. Obviously, there are other companies that are extending their reach to bring others kind of like under the tent, if you will. But I do think that's where the magic starts to happen, and it is happening. Organizations which I'm sure you're familiar with, as an example, Fashion for Good is a wonderful example of a coalition of different parts of the industry, but brands, manufacturers, etc., coming together to share solutions with the belief that we get better and stronger together. This isn't and shouldn't be about competition, although it is my belief that those that harness these solutions will in the end be the ones that win. But as I say, like, the magic is in coming together.
Absolutely. And that coming together, it's a little like a ball game. You have to all agree on the rules and come together to play. And then on the pitch, absolutely, you can compete. So there's still the business opportunities, the business advantage, the business competitiveness. But on the things that we have to agree on, it's about collaboration. It's about coalition. It's great to hear that that's happening in the fashion industry.
I want to really lean into this question of strategic intent, how you harness strategic intent. You describe that as where the magic happens. We're used to thinking in terms of a boardroom agenda, that you might be 45 minutes into a board meeting. Now it's time to discuss climate. We'll discuss climate for 10 minutes because there it is on the agenda. We've ticked that box. But that way of thinking doesn't represent the marriage of purpose with strategic business intent that you've just been talking about. So I'm really interested in the practicalities of how strategic intent can be brought into a boardroom conversation by individual directors. What does that look like in terms of the broad agenda of the board? And can you give us any experience or even recommendations as to how board directors should approach that?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. And first of all, I will say I am fortunate that I am working with and on and for boards that are at this place of kind of strategic integration in I won't call it sophisticated, but intentional way. However, for those that aren't there yet, I'll take climate being on the agenda over the alternative of nothing. So I don't want to, diss those that might just have a first step as getting it on the agenda. But fortunately, that's not true for me. And so I think, I'm pretty practical, and this goes back to my operating days for sure. So first off, in my experience, once I do believe that tying climate into purpose is vitally important, so that every member of the organization and every stakeholder has a visceral understanding of why it matters. I think that's like number one. But once that is done, then getting clear on what matters relative to the most significant risk, how those risks translate to opportunities, and then clearly prioritizing and executing. But I'm going to back it up. I am a very outspoken advocate of the TCFD framework. I can't say that I have used it to the letter with every board that I've served on, because I haven't. But the simplicity of the frame, in my experience, has allowed and supported teams in getting their heads around the impact of climate on their businesses in a way that they can relate to. So clearly there's the risk opportunity, the most basic part of the framework, but then breaking risks down into physical risks, transitional risks, whatever it is. I find that framework to be an incredibly useful primer to level set teams around what exactly are we talking about here. By the way, there are other frameworks. My point is, pick a framework. Number two is understand what counts. And when I say what counts, I mean, what are the most meaningful things to get after? We can call that materiality if we want to. That's the most generally used term. Even at Eileen Fisher, when I got there were some really interesting efforts going on, but honestly, well-intended efforts that didn't amount to much. So part of our governance was, okay, let's get clear on what matters. So pick a frame, get clear on what matters in terms of prioritization as it relates to materiality. Integrate those things into the strategy with SMART goals, if you will, so measurable, actionable goals. And then ultimately measure and communicate. Like, those are kind of the steps. And I suppose I find myself smiling a bit, because climate is no different than any other strategic intent in a corporation. We actually don't need to have a separate conversation. It's more like, well, how do you achieve all the other things that are vital to developing a durable and resilient business? Do that. I think where teams get stuck is they feel intimidated or they don't know where to start. And so it's not so much about the process, it's actually about getting started.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And I can't resist a quick plug and to say to our listeners, there are plenty of resources on the Climate Governance Initiative website about the TCFD framework, about the World Economic Forum principles, and any other framework that you might choose, freely available on the Climate Governance Hub. Just type that into a search engine of your choice and you'll get there.
So I actually want to sort of move away and ask a slightly different question. So tell us a little bit about Alante Capital. It sounds super interesting. It focuses on decarbonisation. Is that correct?
Yes, but a bit more specific than that. So Alante Capital was founded in 2018, and it was founded with the intention of finding, investing, and scaling in sustainable solutions for the fashion, home, and outdoor industries. Ultimately, to bring them to scale, which, as I was talking to about earlier, is currently a barrier. And so the investments that we make are specifically in solutions that solve the four things that I talked about earlier that are the biggest culprits of greenhouse gas emissions for the fashion industry. So if you kind of go around the horn, if you will, we're talking about things like material innovation, supply chain innovation, of course, circular design. We can go into lots of detail on any part of them. But the opportunity to become involved with Alante, for me, created a tremendous synergy between the work that I was already doing on the boards that I serve on, and ultimately has helped to connect the dots to create coalition in my own way too, relative to bringing some of our investments, kind of creating awareness to the companies that I work with so that they can get to solving the problems more quickly.
That's an amazing, amazing vision for an investment company, and great that you see both sides of it and can input from both sides to the other. It's rare that you get those two views in the same person, being able to help both sides of the coin, as it were. I'm really interested about Alante. How do you identify and evaluate the investment opportunities? Obviously, there are lots of technologies and processes and systems out there which would love to be invested in by Alante. How do you evaluate those, both for financial performance and obviously long-term sustainability, which or long-term stewardship perhaps is a better phrase? Just interested to know how that happens.
Sure. I mean, honestly, it's not that different than other investments, but let me just kind of break it down. So the first thing is, what problem is this company solving? And ensuring that they are clear about that, right? Because sometimes that's not even true. Is this whatever, fill in the blank, truly differentiated and defensible? Is another really important question. Understanding both what it will take to scale and what the potential barriers to scale are. Those are equally important. And for the sake of this discussion, I'll make my final point to be, who is the team made up of? And is this a group of people that we can get behind? It's been, I love all of the work that I do. The work that we do here is incredibly gratifying in the sense of having the opportunity not only to support by way of dollars and investment, but for me, actually even more gratifying, to support our portfolio companies kind of day in and day out as a trusted advisor to help support them through all the highs and the lows of startup world. I should say we invest early stage, so not pre-revenue, but generally seed stage, and then we will do follow-on Series A, even sometimes Series B. But so it's early stage, and there are really high highs and there are really low lows, and being there, not literally, but figuratively, shoulder to shoulder with these founders doing very important work is tremendously gratifying.
And for them, I imagine it's vital having someone with your experience, your knowledge, and your passion in this field, giving them advice, giving them mentoring, because that's such a difficult, such a stressful time of any startup. To be working with you just makes all the difference for those founders. That's fantastic.
I want to take us back, Lisa, into those boards that you serve on in your capacity as an independent director. Because again, we've started to think a lot about what it feels like to be a board director in a meeting that's discussing, well, we're back to strategic intent, I guess. How do you as an individual board director bring that into the conversation in the boardroom and feel confident and secure and supported when you're making those points contributing towards the strategic intent of the company? We heard a bit about the importance of allies in the boardroom, how often a board director might be a lone voice, especially if they've been brought in to be, in quotes, the sustainability director, the person filling that particular gap in the skills matrix. How do you convert that lone expertise or passion into something that the entire board takes on as a responsibility?
So I have to say that my board experience is unique because I find myself on boards with like-minded people at like-minded companies. I think it is important for me to answer this question in a way that is actually a bit disassociative of my own experience. So pulling back and thinking about conversations and also observations that I've had with others that haven't had my board experience, I think the following comes to mind. One, I've already said it in our discussion here today, but I think it bears repeating, which is The topic of climate, I think, is often overwhelming, maybe even intimidating. And for those that aren't comfortable with it, being vulnerable as a board director is not an emotion that is welcomed. So acknowledging that emotional dynamic, I think, informs the following. One, creating a level playing field is essential to get into the conversation. So let's paint a scenario whereby there's a climate advocate on a board and they find themselves around the table with others that don't have the same appreciation of the risks and opportunities that present themselves as related to climate. I think number one is to build interest through education and that level playing field that I've spoken about. Two, be fact-based, very important. And through being fact-based, develop a compelling platform, for lack of a better term, that communicates the significance of risk and opportunity related to the topic. And then find one thing to agree on and do that to get started. I think I've already said it as well, but this idea of getting started for those that haven't is so vital here, because it's also been my observation that once boards get into the work, they quickly realize that they should have done so sooner. I'm reminded of a Chinese proverb that is the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is today. And I think, this is true for this topic with boards.
Absolutely. Really interested to hear you earlier talking about culture and values, and that being core to how you've chosen throughout your career, what you do and where you work. And obviously not every board, not every company has those values and cultures that prioritize stewardship and ethical practices. I'm really interested to hear whether you have any ideas how board directors, or how more generally, how we can start to shape start to change the culture and values of those organizations who have not yet started on that climate or that stewardship journey.
Well, I think, one thing, first I'll say the fact and then I'll say an opinion. It is a fact that the most valuable companies in the world are those that strategically align the cultural aspirations of the company with the strategic aspirations of the company. That is a fact. So if we are looking at a company that has only solved for one side of that equation, one could argue, this isn't mathematical, but one could argue they're missing 50% of their opportunity. And with that in mind, now my opinion is culture happens whether you define it or not. So the advice that I would give for those that haven't yet invested the time and energy to define the culture that they aspire to is take stock of where you are, recognize what's good about the place that you've created, what needs work about the place that you've created, and then go through a process, much like strategic planning, that makes each, vision, mission, values, people characteristics, each of the elements of culture defined, explicit, understood, and very importantly, holds people accountable.
And that accountability is so important, as you say.
Again, thinking back to the time that we spent in Geneva, we heard about the importance of regulation, of the regulatory environment, but we also if I remember, heard some voices expressing a fear that by setting a minimum standard for disclosure, for climate performance, broadly described, by setting that minimum standard, you're also defining a floor that it's okay to reach, and beyond which it's not necessary to reach. And instead of defining that floor, we should be encouraging high flyers to go beyond it. And you've said a couple of times in this conversation, and I found myself nodding along violently, but we should always bear in mind there are board directors and there are great companies that are right at the start of this journey, and we should think about how to make things easy for them and to support them. So how do you think about that sort of being pulled in different directions in terms of policy? Should policy be aiming to support those at the beginning of the journey or those at the end of it? Sometimes those things seem to be in opposition, and I guess the trick is making sure they're not. I wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
I do have thoughts about this. I think that in my experience, those boards that are stuck in a disclosure mindset, that are, overly burdened by regulation, are missing the opportunity. I think this is a situation where, while I 100% appreciate the floor versus ceiling conversation, and for more sophisticated conversations, I can hop right on that bandwagon, but the vast majority are at the beginning, and I'll take progress over perfection any day. And I actually think that a little bit of regulation can go a long way in getting into the conversation, kind of as I intimated before. And as such, I hope, and has been my experience, with that can bring collaboration and creativity that is because there's a little room to breathe versus just feeling like it's disclosure.
So we've talked a lot about the wonderful work that you've done, the companies, the culture, the values. You make it sound so easy. You make it sound, just why are we not all doing this? But I'm sure you must have come up against challenges and barriers and obstacles. I'd just be really interested to hear, if you can tell us about some of those challenges that you've come across when you've been trying to embed climate action across your organizations and how you've overcome them.
I appreciate you saying that, I make it sound easy. Well, I don't know if I do or I don't, but again, I have to say that I have chosen to work with the companies that I work with because they are ahead of the curve and can and will and do lead the way. My experience is in the minority. That's important to say up front. But by the same token, I think there's tremendous value in being able to share what's possible, and my experience, so that others can see the other side and see that they can get to the other side. But I think where one of the places that I have seen discord and also solved for, both as an operator and also as a board director, is when the intent doesn't trickle all the way down to aligned incentives. We talked a little bit about accountability, and obviously accountability is related to incentives. But I think in my experience, it's one thing for individuals to understand why it matters and what their job is and what their responsibility is. It's another thing for them to be rewarded for it. And so I would say that last link that we haven't yet talked about and are talking about now is important to recognize. I said once, what did I say? I said, what's measured matters, what's rewarded reigns. I think it's true.
I love that. Have you seen any really good examples of where the reward has made a difference in the way a company's managing to embed climate action, or more broadly, stewardship action in their in the way they work?
Yeah, I'm reminded of, so I spent a decade of my career at Nike, and I'm reminded of when I was there. At the time, I was leading a division of footwear, and the CEO was Mark Parker. Nike takes a lot of heat for a lot of things, but I will tell you, as an insider at one time, they also do some really important work at scale that they don't get credit for, and they should. Some of that is around sustainability and climate, even before it mattered and even before they talked about it publicly. But that's an aside. We can have another podcast for that discussion. But at a point in time, we had our sustainability efforts centralized within the corporation, and that work was kind of in a corner over there, and those of us that were operating didn't so much know what was going on and didn't understand how it related to our job. Under Mark Parker, he realized, no, we need to integrate this. Anyway, long story short, we developed a materials strategy such that it was a Olympics inspired, interestingly enough, gold, silver, bronze material badging, and everybody was given goals relative to how we needed to approach our footwear product creation in a way that ultimately made for better material choices and obviously did less harm. I'll keep it brief to say that the satellite team had been operating in isolation for years. Once we integrated, made clear goals, and ultimately put action against it, we hit our goals within 18 months.
That's glorious. Thanks for sharing that, Lisa. We have one last question for you as we come into the final few minutes of this conversation. And that's just to ask you if you have one key message that you could deliver to companies, to organizations, to share your experience with those that may be a little behind in the climate journey. What would your one key message be?
I am going to intentionally repeat myself to double down on get started, get into the conversation, put it on the agenda. Even if that is the low stake that we're starting with, start with that. Create a level playing field, and ultimately, at the very least, commit to one action that will be taken to begin the journey.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Thanks for everything that you've said to us. Power to your arm, and thanks for being such a brilliant climate champion in the boards on which you sit.
I appreciate the exchange. Thank you so much.
The Climate Governance Initiative is a global non-profit network reaching more than 100,000 board directors. Most of the world's greenhouse gas emissions come from the private sector. So the central question the initiative asks is, what if every company had a climate target and a plan to meet it? We work globally with over 30 chapters reaching board directors in over 70 countries, and our work draws on the principles for effective climate governance set out by the World Economic Forum. If you want to know more, there's a link in the show notes where all our content is available for free and where you can find your local chapter.
This podcast was recorded in August 2024. Next time, we'll be speaking to Chunghwa Wu for a unique perspective as a member of the board of a lithium mining company in China. She is the chair of the Asia-Pacific Water Forum and a member of the World Economic Forum's community of climate governance experts.